Fujian Province, is a city known for its historic temples, lush landscapes, and the quiet perseverance of its people. Among them was Xie Tianqin, a middle-aged history teacher dedicated to her only son, Wu Xieyu. Her life had not been easy. She had lost her husband to illness in 2010 and had since poured all her love, hopes, and aspirations into raising their son, who was pursuing a bright academic future at one of China's most prestigious institutions, Peking University. For many, Wu Xieyu embodied the dreams of countless parents, a young man who seemed destined for greatness. But beneath the veneer of academic success and dutiful sonhood lay a mind unraveling under the weight of expectations, isolation, and a profound inner despair. On July 10, 2015, this despair manifested in an unthinkable act that would shock the nation and ignite discussions on mental health, familial pressure, and the darker side of ambition. Born on October 7, 1994, in Nanping, Fujian, Wu Xieyu was a gifted child. His parents, Xie Tianqin and Wu Xieyu, nurtured his talents from a young age. The family relocated to Fuzhou in 1996, where Xie Tianqin began working as a history teacher at the local railway middle school. Her son's intelligence became apparent early on. He excelled in school, consistently ranking at the top of his class. His parents beamed with pride, seeing him as the fulfillment of their dreams for a better future. However, tragedy struck in 2010 when Wu Xieyu succumbed to illness. His death left a void in the family, one that Wu Xieyu, then only 16, found difficult to fill. His father's absence weighed heavily on him, and though he continued to achieve academically, a seed of despondency had been planted. For Xie Tianqin, her husband's death only strengthened her resolve to see her son succeed. She poured all her energy into guiding Wu Xieyu, often with high expectations and little respite. For her, his success was not only a fulfillment of his own potential, but a tribute to his late father. In 2012, Wu Xieyu achieved a remarkable feat. He was admitted to Peking University's School of Economics, with a recommendation bypassing the fiercely competitive Gaokao exam. At the prestigious university, his academic journey continued to impress. In his first year, he was recognized as a AAA student and later received scholarships, including the Liao Keiyuan Scholarship, in acknowledgement of his outstanding performance. His future seemed bright, with aspirations to study abroad, a plan bolstered by his excellent GRE scores, which placed him among the top 5% globally. Yet, the move to Beijing also meant being far away from home and his mother. The newfound freedom was coupled with an overwhelming academic environment, and the stress of maintaining high standards gradually took its toll. Wu became increasingly withdrawn, retreating from social interactions and focusing solely on his studies. Beneath the surface, feelings of anxiety, inadequacy, and existential dread festered. Friends and classmates noted his reclusive nature and occasional outbursts of melancholy, but few knew the extent of his internal struggles. Wu's mother, unaware of the depth of his troubles, continued to expect greatness from him. Her frequent phone calls and messages, filled with reminders of his responsibilities and the sacrifices she had made, began to weigh on him. To her, they were words of encouragement. To him, they were chains of obligation, tightening with each passing day. By early 2015, Wu's mental state had deteriorated significantly. He was haunted by memories of his father's death and had become preoccupied with the idea of life's futility. He struggled with insomnia and experienced bouts of depression that went untreated. In his mind, a dark thought began to take shape, one that seemed to offer both escape and a twisted form of relief for his mother, whom he had come to believe was suffering as much as he was. Wu's belief that his mother's life had lost its meaning after his father's death became the core of a horrifying plan. He rationalized that by ending her life, he would be sparing her further suffering, and afterward, he would end his own life to reunite the family. His delusions distorted reality, convincing him that his actions would be an act of mercy rather than a crime. In April 2015, Wu began preparing for the act with cold precision. He purchased various tools online, including knives, plastic sheeting, and isolation suits, items that would aid him in deferring up the crime. He chose July 10th as the date, its significance being the reverse of his own birthday, October 7th, a morbid reminder of his impending self-destruction. On the afternoon of July 10th, 2015, Wu put his plan into motion. He waited for his mother to return home. As she entered the apartment, he attacked her with a dumbbell, striking her head multiple times. The blows were swift, merciless, and final. In the aftermath, he wrapped her body in layers of plastic sheeting, using activated carbon to absorb the odor of decomposition. He placed her remains in the bedroom, covering the windows with black tape to prevent light from entering. In the hours that followed, the weight of what he had done began to sink in. The reality of his actions, coupled with the gruesome sight of his mother's lifeless form, overwhelmed him. The resolve to take his own life evaporated, replaced by panic and a desperate need to conceal his crime. He hastily began covering his tracks, sending text messages from his mother's phone to friends and family, fabricating a story that she had traveled abroad with him for his studies. To solidify this lie, he even forged a resignation letter from her and mailed it to her workplace. In the months following the murder, Wu continued to live in the apartment where the crime had occurred, surrounded by the very evidence of his heinous act. He meticulously maintained the facade of normalcy, using his mother's phone to communicate with relatives and friends, pretending that she was alive and well. His fabricated narrative included claims of studying abroad, which served as a pretext to solicit money from relatives. He defrauded them of approximately 1.34 million yuan, funds he claimed were needed for tuition fees, living expenses, and other necessities associated with studying overseas. To evade detection, Wu purchased over 10 forged identity documents, which allowed him to travel throughout China, frequently changing locations to avoid the authorities. His elaborate deceptions and careful planning allowed him to stay one step ahead of the police for nearly 3 years. During this time, he worked odd jobs under false identities, including stints as a nightclub waiter and a private tutor. He often boasted about being a Peking University or Tsinghua University graduate, though most people dismissed his claims as empty bragging. As the months passed, the continued absence of Xie Tianqin raised suspicions among her family. Her brother and other relatives grew increasingly concerned when their attempts to reach her were met with evasive replies and excuses. On February 5, 2016, Wu sent a message to his uncle, stating that he and his mother would be returning from Boston, where they had supposedly been staying. When the promised reunion did not occur, and there was no response to further messages, the family began to fear the worst. On February 14, 2016, the police were called to the apartment in Fuzhou, where Xie Tianqin had lived. Upon entry, officers discovered her remains, wrapped in plastic and placed under the bed. The layers of plastic sheeting, along with the activated carbon, had slowed decomposition, but the sight and stench were unmistakably horrific. The revelation of the crime sent shockwaves through the community and quickly became a national news story. With the discovery of his mother's body, Wu Xieyu became a wanted man, and a nationwide manhunt was launched. For years, the trail ran cold. Wu's meticulous preparations, including the use of multiple forged identities, allowed him to evade capture. He traveled across various provinces, often staying in budget hotels and avoiding public transportation where surveillance was prevalent. His lifestyle became increasingly erratic. He spent lavishly on lottery tickets and gifts for women he met, and his once prized academic aspirations faded into the background as he struggled to maintain his freedom. In his last months on the run, Wu worked at a nightclub in Chongqing under an assumed name. He had grown more careless, often boasting about his background, though most people dismissed his stories as the ramblings of a self-deluded drifter. His luck finally ran out on April 20th, 2019, at Chongqing Jiangbei International Airport. The Sky-Eye facial recognition system flagged him as he entered the terminal to see off a female acquaintance. Within moments, the authorities swooped in and took him into custody, ending his nearly 4-year run from justice. After his capture, Wu Xieyu confessed to the murder, but remained evasive when asked to explain his motive and the events leading up to the crime. During the initial 8-hour interrogation, he avoided answering direct questions about why he killed his mother, choosing instead to speak at length about unrelated academic topics. His evasiveness frustrated investigators, who were seeking to understand the true motivations behind his gruesome actions. Despite Wu's reluctance to discuss key aspects of the crime, certain details began to emerge. He admitted that his father's death had marked a turning point in his life, leading to a profound sense of emptiness. He He had grown increasingly paranoid and resentful toward his extended family, whom he blamed for not offering sufficient support when his father was ill. Wu suggested that his decision to defraud his relatives of over $1,000,000 was partly driven by a desire for revenge, believing that their earlier neglect had contributed to his father's death. During the trial, Wu spoke about his mother, describing her as a good woman, a good wife, and a good mother, but he struggled to articulate why he ultimately chose to kill her. The court heard that he had entertained thoughts of suicide multiple times after his father's passing, and had even attempted to kill himself before deciding to murder his mother instead. Wu claimed that he had rationalized the act as a way to free her from the suffering of life, though this explanation did little to assuage the horror of his crime. The trial began on December 24, 2020, at the Fuzhou Intermediate People's Court. The courtroom was packed, with many members of the public and media eager to hear the details of one of the most shocking matricide cases in recent Chinese history. The prosecution laid out a compelling case against Wu, charging him with murder, fraud, and the illegal purchase of identity documents. They depicted him as a calculated and cold-blooded killer who had meticulously planned his mother's death and then deceived his relatives to fund a life on the run. Wu's defense team sought to mitigate his culpability by emphasizing his deteriorating mental health, suggesting that his actions stemmed from psychological issues exacerbated by the immense pressure to succeed and his unresolved grief over his father's death. They submitted a request for a psychological evaluation, which had been previously declined during the investigation. The defense also presented letters from Wu's relatives, including his aunt and uncle, who expressed some degree of forgiveness and a willingness to see leniency in sentencing, citing concerns that Wu might be suffering from mental disorders. Throughout the trial, Wu maintained a calm and detached demeanor, often staring blankly as the charges were read out. When he spoke, his tone was measured and devoid of emotion, adding to the impression that he was disconnected from the gravity of his crimes. He admitted to all 3 charges, but contested the severity of the punishment, hoping to avoid the death penalty. On August 26, 2021, the Fuzhou Intermediate People's Court handed down its first instance verdict. Wu Xieyu was sentenced to death for the murder of his mother. He was also sentenced to 11 years in prison for the fraud charges and an additional 3 years for the illegal purchase and use of identity documents. In total, Wu faced a death sentence and significant prison time for the other offenses, along with a fine of 130,000 yuan. He was also deprived of political rights for life. The severity of the sentence was a reflection of the brutality of the crime and the calculated nature of his subsequent actions to cover it up. Wu appealed the sentence, arguing that his mental state should have been given greater consideration and that the punishment was overly harsh. He expressed a desire to redeem himself while alive, and his defense team pushed for a reconsideration of the psychological evaluation. Despite the appeal, many legal experts believed that the original sentence would likely be upheld, given the premeditated nature of the crime. In May 2023, nearly 2 years after the initial sentencing, the Fujian Provincial High People's Court held a public second-instance trial to review Wu Xieyu's appeal. During this trial, Wu once again admitted to the murder and fraud, but emphasized the psychological toll that his father's death had taken on him. He reiterated that he had considered suicide as a means of escape, and that his actions were driven by a deeply distorted perception of life and death. However, the court was not persuaded by these arguments, and on May 30, 2023, it upheld the original death sentence, rejecting the appeal. The presiding judges concluded that the facts were clear and the evidence conclusive, with the brutality of the crime and Wu's subsequent deceitful behavior leaving little room for leniency. The ruling sent a clear message that matricide, no matter the circumstances, would be met with the full force of the law. Wu Xieyu was executed by lethal injection on January 31, 2024, at the age of 29. His final days were spent in solitary reflection, where he reportedly wrote a lengthy letter of repentance to his relatives. In the 50,000-word document, he recounted his struggles with hypochondria, paranoia, and the profound sense of abandonment he felt after his father's death. He confessed to harboring resentment towards his extended family, whom he felt had failed his father in his time of need, and acknowledged that his motives for fraud were not only financial but also fueled by a desire for revenge. In his letter, Wu wrote about his mother in haunting terms. He described finding her diary after her death, where she had expressed pride in her son's accomplishments and hoped that her late husband could bless their son from the afterlife. The discovery of these entries plunged him into an even deeper state of regret and despair, a realization that came too late. He admitted to being crushed by the weight of his actions, writing, "The most terrible pain and regret crushed me. I couldn't bear it. I ran away. I left my mother alone at home." Despite his expressions of remorse, Wu remained a controversial figure, with public opinion largely condemning him for the calculated nature of his crime and the heartless exploitation of his relatives. His defense lawyer, Xu Xin, later stated that the case highlighted the need for the legal system to better address psychological issues in criminal cases. However, many believe that Wu's fate was a just consequence for a crime so heinous. The case of Wu Xieyu went beyond a tragic matricide. It served as a mirror reflecting several critical issues in contemporary Chinese society. The immense pressure placed on young people to succeed academically was seen as a contributing factor to Wu's mental health decline. As a bright student from a prestigious university, his fall from grace was a stark reminder that academic achievement does not equate to emotional well-being. The societal fixation on success, often to the detriment of psychological health, became a focal point in the national discussion sparked by the case. Mental health awareness was another crucial aspect brought to light. Throughout his youth and early adulthood, Wu exhibited signs of depression, anxiety, and suicidal ideation. However, his struggles went largely unnoticed, and the absence of timely intervention ultimately contributed to the horrific outcome. The case prompted calls for schools, universities, and families to pay greater attention to the mental well-being of students, advocating for more accessible psychological resources and support. The tragic relationship between Wu and his mother also ignited debates about family dynamics and the expectations placed on children by their parents. For many, the intense bond between Xie Tianqin and her son symbolized a pervasive problem in Chinese society, where parental love often comes with high expectations and a lack of emotional communication. The case served as a cautionary tale about the dangers of overemphasizing academic success while neglecting the nurturing of a child's emotional resilience. The life of Wu Xieyu, once full of promise, ended in tragedy and infamy. His crime, the brutal murder of his own mother, forever marred what could have been a story of academic success and family triumph. Instead, it became a narrative of despair, psychological unraveling, and the devastating consequences of untreated mental health issues and familial pressure. As the story unfolded, it left behind not just the horror of a matricide, but also a societal reckoning with the issues that contributed to such a catastrophe. While the law delivered its final judgment, the broader conversation sparked by the case served as a reminder that behind the pursuit of excellence must lie a commitment to mental health and open communication. The tragedy of Wu Xieyu and his mother underscored the urgent need for compassion, understanding, and systemic change in addressing the pressures faced by young people and their families in modern society. The conclusion of the Wu Xieyu case brought closure to a tragic narrative that had unfolded over nearly a decade. The execution on January 31st, 2024, marked the end of a long and convoluted legal journey, but the implications of the crime extended far beyond the courtroom. The haunting tale of a promising young student turned fugitive and murderer left an indelible mark on Chinese society, stirring debates about the interplay between academic pressure, mental health, family expectations, and societal values. The Wu Xieyu case resonated deeply across China, not only because of the horrific nature of the crime, but also because of the broader themes it brought to light. As the details of the case emerged, they forced a reckoning with the deep-seated cultural norms surrounding education and family. In Chinese society, there is a long-standing emphasis on academic success as a primary means of achieving social mobility and securing a prosperous future. This emphasis, while fostering diligence and ambition, also places immense pressure on students to excel at all costs. The rigid educational system, with its high-stakes exams and hyper-competitive environment, often leaves little room for addressing emotional well-being. Wu Xieyu's life story served as a grim reminder that even those who seem to be thriving academically can be struggling in silence. His transition from a top student at Peking University to a desperate fugitive highlighted the dangerous consequences of neglecting mental health, particularly among young people under intense pressure to succeed. Following the public outcry over the case, there was a noticeable shift in the national discourse about mental health. Schools, universities, and government institutions began to prioritize mental health resources and programs aimed at alleviating stress and providing psychological support for students. Awareness campaigns sought to break the stigma associated with seeking help for mental health issues, emphasizing that it was not a sign of weakness but a necessary step toward a healthier life. At the heart of the case was the relationship between Wu Xieyu and his mother, Xie Tianqin. For many Chinese families, the concept of filial piety, respect, and duty toward one's parents is a fundamental value. This principle was deeply ingrained in Wu's upbringing, where his academic achievements were seen as a means of honoring his mother's sacrifices. Xie Tianqin, who had devoted herself to her son's education after the loss of her husband, naturally placed high expectations on Wu, seeing his success as both a personal and familial triumph. However, the case revealed the darker side of these cultural expectations. The intense pressure to meet parental expectations can lead to a feeling of suffocation, especially when those expectations are rigidly tied to academic success. For Wu, his mother's love became intertwined with her demands for excellence, and the high stakes of fulfilling these demands contributed to his deteriorating mental state. When faced with failure or the fear of falling short, he could not reconcile his love for his mother with the overwhelming guilt and despair he felt. The tragedy sparked discussions on how Chinese families could better navigate the balance between ambition and emotional support. It raised awareness of the need for parents to be more attuned to their children's mental health and to recognize that academic achievements do not equate to happiness or self-worth. In the years following the case, there was a noticeable shift in parenting discussions, with a growing emphasis on fostering open communication, understanding, and support, rather than solely focusing on academic results. The sentencing of Wu Xieyu to death was met with a mixture of responses. Some saw it as a necessary and just outcome for a crime of such brutality and premeditation, while others questioned whether the death penalty was an appropriate solution, especially given the mental health aspects of the case. The legal system had to grapple with the complexities of Wu's psychological state, which played a significant role in the defense's arguments for leniency. Although the court did not find sufficient grounds to overturn the death sentence based on Wu's mental health claims, the case did bring to the forefront the need for the legal system to better integrate psychological evaluations in criminal proceedings. Some legal experts argued that cases involving severe psychological distress or mental illness should be approached with more nuanced sentencing guidelines, potentially allowing for rehabilitative measures rather than solely punitive ones. The execution, while legally justified, could not address the root causes that led to the crime. For many, Wu's death did not signify justice in its truest sense, but rather underscored the tragic waste of a life that might have taken a different path if early intervention and mental health support had been available. His case highlighted the need for reforms not just in criminal justice but also in mental health policy and education. The legacy of the Wu Xieyu case extends beyond the courtroom and the media headlines. It has left a profound impact on how Chinese society views education, family, and mental health. As China continues to develop and modernize, the case has served as a sobering reminder that economic progress and social mobility should not come at the cost of emotional well-being. There is a growing recognition that academic success must be accompanied by a holistic approach to education that prioritizes the mental and emotional health of students. The tragedy of Wu Xieyu and his mother will continue to serve as a cautionary tale, urging parents, educators, and policymakers to pay closer attention to the silent struggles of young people. It has spurred changes in educational institutions, which now incorporate mental health awareness and support programs more actively. Some schools have introduced mandatory mental health screenings for students, alongside stress management workshops and access to counseling services. In terms of family dynamics, the case has encouraged a shift towards more empathetic parenting, where children are seen not just as future success stories, but as individuals with their own emotional needs and aspirations. This cultural shift, though gradual, reflects a growing awareness that nurturing a child's psychological well-being is just as important as fostering academic excellence. The aftermath of the Wu Xieyu case also raised broader questions about how mental health issues are handled within the criminal justice system. The consideration of mental health as a mitigating factor in sentencing, particularly in severe crimes like murder, remains a contentious issue. While some argue that mental health should play a significant role in determining culpability and sentencing, others maintain that the severity of the crime should take precedence. In response to cases like Wu's, there have been calls for more comprehensive reforms to ensure that psychological evaluations are thorough and integrated throughout the criminal investigation and trial processes. There is also a push for establishing specialized rehabilitation programs within the prison system for offenders with mental health conditions, emphasizing treatment over punishment where appropriate. Moreover, the case has contributed to a greater cultural acceptance of discussing mental health openly, a topic that has traditionally been stigmatized in Chinese society. Public awareness campaigns and non-governmental organizations have played a role in shifting the narrative, advocating for more resources to be allocated towards mental health services, including crisis hotlines, community counseling centers, and educational initiatives that target early intervention. Wu Xieyu's story is ultimately one of loss of life, loss of potential, and loss of a future that might have been different. His letters of repentance, written during his time on death row, reveal a young man who was grappling with profound regret and a desire to be remembered for something other than his crime. However, the enormity of the harm he caused to his mother and his family could not be undone by words alone. The question of whether Wu could have been rehabilitated if given a different sentence will remain unanswered. What is clear, though, is that his case forced many to confront uncomfortable truths about the pressures that young people face and the societal changes needed to prevent similar tragedies in the future. As the final chapter of Wu Xieyu's life closed with his execution, the lessons drawn from his story continue to reverberate, prompting efforts to ensure that the conditions that contributed to his downfall are addressed. The Wu Xieyu case stands as a profound tragedy that compels reflection on the intersections of family, education, mental health, and justice. It serves as a reminder that behind the pursuit of academic and career success are human beings who must be nurtured emotionally and supported psychologically. The case underscored the need for a society that values compassion alongside achievement and provides a safety net for those struggling under the weight of expectations. As the discussions inspired by the case continue to evolve, there is hope that its legacy will translate into meaningful change. The reforms in education, increased mental health awareness, and evolving family dynamics all signal steps towards a more humane and understanding society. The lessons learned from the tragedy of Wu Xieyu and his mother have the potential to shape a future where young people can pursue their dreams without being consumed by them, where families can support without suffocating, and where justice is tempered with empathy. Ultimately, while Wu Xieyu's life ended in darkness, the story of his downfall and the conversations it sparked have cast a light on issues long buried in silence. It is through this painful reckoning that society can hope to move towards a future where such tragedies become increasingly rare, not because they are forgotten, but because they are remembered and learned from.